So while France felt relatively satisfied with the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, there still was a great deal of unrest on the home front even after the war. In particular, the rise of communism, the spread of the success of the Bolsheviks in overthrowing the Russian government and in seizing power was an inspiration for many on the political left in France. As we've already seen over the course of this class, there had been a pretty strong tradition of radical left politics within France, especially in Paris, and many of them were very much inspired by the example of the Bolsheviks and hoped to emulate them in France. In order to kind of stave off worker unrest early in April 1919, the government passed a law that granted the 8-hour day. That is to say that workers only had to work 8 hours a day, and anything they worked more than 8 hours was considered overtime and was paid as overtime. But nevertheless, there was this very strong sense within France that the threat of communism or the threat of socialism was growing. Of course, there had been no elections in France during the First World War, and once the war was over, it was time to hold elections again. So in 1919, a general election was held in France. You can see this is one election posted here, very much emphasizing the idea that France is at risk of a communist takeover, and very much was meant to discourage voters from voting for the Socialist Party in particular, which they feared, with some justification, was under the influence of the Communist Party in Russia. So here are a couple of other election posters. So again, on the left, a picture of the Bolshevik with the knife in his mouth. The threat of communism facing France, and then of course on the right we have a picture of Clemenceau, the father of victory, and I'm trying to encourage people to vote for centrist or right-wing parties. And what was the result of the elections? Well, basically, the French system of government had been changed during the war or after the war to grant more seats to parties that formed coalitions in order to provide some kind of stable government. And the basic result was that parties on the right and the centre-right won a pretty large majority. What was called the Bloc National, that they combined together. So some moderate radical Republicans, and certainly some right-wing conservatives came together to form the Bloc National, or sometimes the Sky Blue coalition, reflecting the name of the uniforms used by French soldiers during the war. This is really the first time since the Dreyfus Affair in the 1890s, or the start of the 20th century, where the left-wing parties had been marginalised from power in France, and this was a very clear victory for the political right in France. However, while the right might have won, the big loser was Georges Clemenceau. Clemenceau hoped that he would be nominated as president for what he felt was his service to France during the war, but while the left hated Clemenceau because of his anti-socialist activities, especially breaking up strikes, many on the right didn't forget that Clemenceau was an avowed anti-clericalist, anti-religion in their eyes, and therefore were more than happy to cut him adrift once the election had been held. So Clemenceau never became president as he had hoped. Instead, the position fell to Alexandre Millerand, and he was to guide the French government, initially as prime minister, then as president, during the 5 years where the Bloc National governed France. And in some ways, the election of 1919 created a more conservative government and really reflected the true values of maybe the ordinary French voter, in that essentially the government was more kind of right-leaning in its policies in the face of an electorate that was probably more moderate than that. But there was still this considerable activism on the left as well. Over the course of 1920, strikes intensified and culminated in a large protest in May Day, May 1st, 1920, where 500,000 people attended the May Day rally. This descends into some violent confrontations with police and sparked a series of nationwide strikes across France over the following week. So for a period of time, the French workers, or many French activists, were trying to essentially create Soviets in France by initiating these strikes. But in the end, the French state was able to repress them, able to fire workers, threaten the rest with unemployment, and defeat the strikes. So the feared Soviet takeover in France, as brought about by the strikes of May 1920, did not take place. However, what did emerge in France was a new actor on the political scene, the Parti Communiste Français, the French Communist Party. That was born out of the Socialist Party. So after the Communist Revolution in 1917, the Bolsheviks established something called the Third International, which was supposed to be a collaborative organization between communist parties around the world. In reality, it was a way for the Russian Bolsheviks to exert control over communist parties elsewhere. When members of the French Socialist Party travelled to Moscow in 1920 to apply for permission to join the Third International, they were told that unless they essentially complied to the demands of the Russian Communist Party, which was to accept orders from Moscow and to ignore their own democratic infrastructure within the Socialist Party, they wouldn't be allowed to join. And this led to a division within the Socialist Party. So the representatives went back to France to inform the French Socialist Party what they'd been told at the Third International. And at the party conference in 1920, a vote was taken on whether to accept the conditions laid down by the the Bolsheviks, or to reject them. And a large majority actually voted to accept these conditions, and that split the Socialist Party. So the larger part of the party actually reformed themselves as the French Communist Party. So they were born out of the French Socialist Party. The minority of members who were left behind elected Leon Blum, who we'll see again in future classes, as their leader. So he leads the Socialist Party from 1920 onwards. Although when I say the party split, it was certainly a majority of the rank and file members remained with the Communist Party of France, but it was more the established politicians remained with the Socialist Party itself. And while the Communist Party was certainly larger when the split took place in 1920, by the middle of the 20th century, the Socialist Party had actually overtaken the Communist Party in terms of its size and influence. The Communist Party, for much of its future, was to be particularly strong in Paris, in what was known as the Red Belt, but outside of Paris, it had minimal electoral success. So the Socialist Party under Leon Blum pretty quickly became the largest left-leaning party once more in France. Of course, the major concern for the French government, especially after the strikes in 1920 had been defeated, was Germany and ensuring that Germany paid its bills. Obviously, the reparations that were placed on Germany after the war were simply enormous, and in fact, there was simply no way, with the German economy destroyed, the Germans could actually repay these bills. Twice in 1920 and 1921, French soldiers were sent into Germany to put pressure onto the French government by seizing certain German cities in order to encourage the Germans to hurry up and pay their bills. These were relatively short occupations, but it did show the French government was willing to exert itself militarily to get what it's considered to be its dues. This policy was most strenuously pushed forward by Raymond Poincaré, who we've come across several times. He was the president of France during the First World War. He returned as prime minister in the middle of the 1920s. And in 1923, when the German government again failed to make its payments, Poincaré decided it was time to take more direct action. Essentially, the French wanted to get paid. Once the Germans were lacking in actually providing the money, the French government decided to act. And what they did by acting was they sent soldiers into the Ruhr. They occupied the Ruhr region shown here, which was one of the major industrial centers of Germany. Their basic idea was, if you guys won't pay what we're owed, we're going to simply extract it ourselves in the form of this occupation. The occupation of the Ruhr. So what we have here is a French soldier confronting an ordinary German. The German military was in no position to resist the French, but the German population living in the Ruhr adopted a policy of passive resistance. And generally on the international stage, France were seen as the aggressors. Perhaps somewhat unfairly, when the French felt they were, by the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, owed this money. The money was not paid, but both the United Kingdom and the United States sympathized much more with the Germans and began to put significant financial pressure on the French to get out of the Ruhr. So France occupied the Ruhr for about a year, but eventually, because of the pressure of the British and the French, the British and the Americans, the costs of the war effort were becoming onerous for the French, the cost of the occupation. So what we have here is, this is a chart of the French franc. Its value dropped 70% over the course of the war, and once the British and Americans began demanding their loans be repaid more quickly in response to the French occupation, it dropped even further. So what we actually ended up getting was a massive decline in the French franc. So, as you can see in this chart here, starting 1923 when the French occupied the Ruhr, the value of the mark or the French franc falls 46% over a period of a year. The French simply cannot sustain the occupation of the Ruhr and they're forced to withdraw. So negotiations take place. The Germans agree to start paying their bills more efficiently, and in response, the British, Americans, and French agreed to reduce the overall burden, overall money the Germans owe to the French. But again, it was kind of a moment of embarrassment for France. They were made to appear kind of weak. Their hope to use their army to enforce German payment failed, and it had also become quite evident that the British and American governments would not help them militarily extract money from Germany. So the guarantees the French thought they had in 1919 with the Treaty of Versailles are suddenly shown to be not quite as ironclad as they had hoped. So, the election of 1924. So, you skilled American historians here should recognize who this is. This is not a French politician, this is Calvin Coolidge. So, this is actually an American diagram, but I'm using it for the French case. The next set of elections held in France were in 1924. In 1919, the Socialist Party had refused to work with the Republicans. Had essentially insisted that they would not enter into government with any other political party apart from themselves. The defeat of 1919 had shown that they needed to change their approach, and therefore in 1924 they combined once again with the radical Republicans, the more moderate French left forces, and campaigned against the Bloc National. So here you see some of the campaign posters that the Socialist Party ran. The idea that the Bloc National is a burden on France. The top picture there, you can see that essentially that the Bloc National is an eclectic mix of clergies and exploitive capitalists and kind of military nut jobs, and therefore they couldn't be trusted with governing France. And the tactics largely worked. You can see, so the French Communist Party had some success, and the Socialist Party won 104 seats, and combined with the various branches of radical Republicans who won 180, the left-leaning parties won and returned to power. So what would this group called? So here's a Jeopardy question for you guys. Etymology. This word is for a collaboration among suppliers to keep their prices high. It comes from the Latin word paper. What is a cartel? And so the government that takes power in 1924 is known as the Cartel de Gauche, or the Cartel de Gauche. That is the left-wing cartel, the party of the left. And their prime minister is Edouard Herriot. Becomes Prime Minister of France. And so after 1924, the brief period of right-wing government in France has passed. The French left has taken power again. But are going, as we're going to see, going to be unable to make the kind of major government changes that they hope to make once they take power.